Shining bright lotus. Welcome, everyone. This is interesting character to land on, and many are not familiar with Vimalakirti, and I would hope, if I'm successful, that it'll perk your interest in the magical world of Vimalakirti. So, sort of trying to starting at the beginning, because I'm assuming that he's not a household term. There's a sutra called the Sutra of Vimalakirti, or the Holy Teachings of Vimalakirti. Okay, and so it's one of the sort of kind of like prize sutra texts of the Mahayana. He less often referred to in Zen, but very much part of the larger canon in a lot of the Chinese Buddhist lineages for about 10 centuries. This was one of the primary texts. And it is often said that the Vimalakirti Sutra has pieces of all the main sutras in it, essentially. So it's kind of like a kind of a big summary of the teachings. And it's not necessarily easy and fun to read. I'm a big fan of the Robert Thurman translation. I don't know if that's going to show up with the screensaver. It is a Robert Thurman, being the Tibetan teacher. It's a fabulous translation. There's lots of translations. When you read it, if you're not used to sort of the sort of farther reaches text like the Lotus Sutra or the Avantamsaka Sutra, you're kind of not used to all the frills that go along with it. There's a lot of interesting frills, and one of the key features and frills is that Vimalakirti apparently is a magical being. Okay, so he conjures things up. So the easiest way to understand what a magical being is like is to think of him as Harry Potter. Okay, Harry Potter is kind of a good analogy for him, because out of all the Bodhisattvas, we've done 6 of them now, he is actually a householder. So in Harry Potter terms, he's a muggle. As opposed to being one of the wizards or the magical beings, he's just a householder. And that is actually one of the key features of Vimalakirti as a teachings is Manjushri, Samantabhadra, Avalokiteshvara. These are really magical beings. There's not like a person who walked the earth who could be this, this person. There really are emanations of energetic archetypes, or you could say they're beings, but they're more beings of our imagination. Vimalakirti, well, we don't really know if he actually existed on the planet, but as a role, just like Harry Potter probably isn't a real person on the planet, but in the narrative, he's a person. He's actually not just a person, he's a householder, which is another key feature of Vimalakirti. So way back in Buddha's times, the Sakyas, which is how you get the term Shakyas, the Shakyamuni, right? The Shakyas was the clan of folks, and they were monks. And not all of them were monks. There's a bunch of folks who were householders, regular folks who followed the Buddha. And so Vimalakirti is actually a householder. He's not a monk. And so that's an important part of his story too. And so that alone is important to us, because as we are as a Sangha, we may have a few of us monks around, which are like myself or Mingpo or Nanda or Engo. We're large or Josen. We're not monks living in monasteries. We're clergy out in the world, and the Sangha primarily is full of householders, and that means that we don't have the joy of sitting around and meditating all day and practicing, we all have regular lives. And so Vimalakirti has a regular life. And apparently, similar to Harry Potter, he seems to be really good at it. He's rather special about how he's very, very super knowledgeable. So as the story goes, apparently Vimalakirti is ill. He's not feeling well, and that will come back to what that represents later on. And so the opening scene of the drama of Vimalakirti is Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, saying to his entourage of bodhisattvas, well, somebody needs to go down there and check out Vimalakirti and make sure he's okay. And what he proceeds to get for about 3 chapters is one by one, each of all the famous bodhisattvas all basically say, nah, I don't really want to go visit that guy, right? And they go, oh, how come you don't want to go visit that guy? Like, he's just a guy, he's a householder, you're a bodhisattva. And each one tells a story about how Vimalakirti showed up in one of their great spots in life and proceeded to basically, in our modern terms, dress me down with actually better dharma than anything I could imagine. Okay, that's how we would say it. But in the literature, it's actually quite fascinating because each little vignette, right? I could actually, let me see if I can even pick one of the vignettes and see if I can give you an examples. This chapter is called The Reluctance of the Bodhisattvas, right? Let's see if I can get one without reading too much. The Buddha says to Maitreya, we know Maitreya, I think we did him her last week. Maitreya, go to Vimalakirti and inquire about his illness. And Maitreya says, Lord, I am indeed reluctant to go to the good man to inquire about his illness. Why, Lord? I remember that one day I was engaged in a conversation with the gods of the Tushita heaven. And the god Tushita and his retinue about the stage of non-regression of the great Bodhisattva. And at that time, Vimalakirti came over and addressed me as follows. Now, I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's like a long thing, but I'll just give you a little bit. Maitreya, the Buddha has prophesied that only one more birth stands between you and unexcelled perfect enlightenment. What kind of birth does that prophecy concern? Maitreya? Is it past? Is it future? Or is it present? If it is a past birth, it is already finished. If it is a future birth, it will never arrive. If it is a present birth, it does not abide. For the Buddha declared, in a single moment, you are born, you age, you die, you transmigrate, and you are reborn. There's more to that particular story, but each little vignette is a story, right? And each one of these bodhisattvas says to the Buddha, I don't want to go visit that guy, okay? And so you're hearing that the larger narrative is who's going to go talk to this guy, right? And what's that going to be like? And then all these they're all teachings. I mean, we could just take that paragraph and unpack it. Right, that one little story. And so it's the kind of book that, you could see folks read and studied for a long time. Let's just take that one story and unpack it for the next half an hour, which we're not going to do. We're just giving the high level overview. Okay, so what the summary is, he's a super bright, smart Dharma teacher. He's a householder. And he's not feeling too good. And so the Buddha says, one by one, go check this guy out, right? And then he ends up, after everybody says no, right, he finally ends up basically Manjushri, the wisdom guy says, all right, I'll go, even though he even tells a story about how Manjushri's been one up by him. Okay, so he says, I'm going to go. And so before he goes, a few things happens. One of them is everybody says, cool, Manjushri's going to go talk to Vimalakirti. I want to be there too. Right? So now that they all said, I don't want to go, they go, great, there's a party going on. There's Dharma combat is actually what you'd call it in Zen. And we want to be there. Okay. Which is first miracle number one, right? So I don't know, I'm using Harry Potter because I love some of the Harry Potter images, but does anyone ever remember how things went when you would go to the Quidditch World Championship and how there would be a series of tents? And then you'd go inside the tent, and inside the tent would be a 3-story building with like 20 people inside. But on the outside, there's just a tent, basically, or Hermione like that too, right? Oops, I just bumped my microphone. There, it's back on. So the Vimalakirti apparently lives in a tent. Like, well, it's not that he lives in. He's actually not only is a householder, he's a wealthy householder, but the room he's in is a 10 by 10 foot room. So then the question is, how are they all gonna fit in there, right? And apparently he just, I guess, I don't know, he waves his wand or wiggles his nose for anyone who remembers Bewitched. And apparently all 130,000 Bodhisattvas who want to go watch the party can all show up and sit in his room, right? And watch this thing. Okay. Not only that, Shariputra, who ends up being kind of the fall guy in this story quite a bit, says there's no chairs. Like, he doesn't say there's no chairs. He says, where are we going to sit? And he doesn't say it, he thinks it. And Vimalakirti says, oh, Shariputra, did you come here to sit or did you come here to like learn? Right? Like he reads his mind. So there's that little magical thing. And so then what apparently he does is he goes to another Buddha land where there are 120-mile high thrones that you can sit on, and he magically brings in all these 120-mile high thrones into this 10 by 10 room so everybody can have a seat. So I'm sort of giving you a flavor of what I mean by a magical text. Okay. Now, we all live in the 21st century where, Harry Potter was a pretty amazing thing, but, we have a fiction. But now you got to like rewind. This is a text that's written almost 20 centuries ago. Okay. So, Harry Potter is a wonderful 21st century thing, but it's interesting that we've been thinking magical thoughts for a long time. And Buddhism has quite a bit of magical stuff in it, okay, which is very different than, say, the Pali Canon, which is actually one of the reasons why, to some extent, a lot of teachers like to stick with the Pali Canon, because they can say, well, this was a real guy, right? Shakyamuni Buddha did live, Gautama, Prince Siddhartha, but the later texts of the Mahayana get pretty far out there. And particularly folks who have an aversion to religion, like because we were raised in faiths that had a little bit too much magicalness in them, like rising from the dead or things like that. That's not what they came here for when they come to Buddhism. They want to meditate and wake up. And so just pointing that out, Vimalakirti is definitely in the magical story. So now you got this 10 by 10 room with this guy sitting on a bed with 130,000 bodhisattvas and entourages sitting in these 120-mile chairs saying, oh, this is going to be a good show. Let's see what's going to happen now, right? And so what ensues is a conversation with Manjushri, basically, right? And same thing. There's a lot of one-upsmanship. Many would say you can't really say that Vimalakirti is the only person who one-ups Manjushri, because Manjushri, there's lots of koans where Manjushri is the fall bodhisattva. For those who remember, recently we did A Woman Comes Out of Samadhi, right, which is the koan where after Buddha speaks, there's a woman who's just blissed out sitting next to her, and Manjushri shows up and said, "Hey, how come she gets to like stay there?" And like what's with that? It's a very interesting one because it's a woman, okay, which is because Buddha was definitely let women eventually. He didn't start that way into his sangha, and Buddha says, "Well, why don't you wake her up and ask her yourself?" At which point he can't wake her up. Right. And then just to tell the end of that story. So then someone from way down the earth, a very low level, kind of dirty, grimy, in the mud Bodhisattva shows up and snaps his finger and up she wakes up. And so Manjushri ends up being, there are many stories of him not being the inside guy. So here's a little dialogue from Manjushri. Manjushri okay, all right. Vimalakirti saw the crown prince Manjushri and addressed him thus. Manjushri, welcome, Manjushri. You're very welcome. There you are. Without any coming, you appear. Without any seeing, you are heard. Without any hearing. So he acknowledges his magic. He just appears. Manjushri says, householder, it is as you say. Who comes, finally comes, not. Who goes, finally goes, not. Why? Who comes is not known to come. Who goes is not known to go. Who appears is finally not to be seen. Welcome to the world of Buddhist liturgy, right? Language that is and isn't. We're in this magical world where, welcome, you're here. And then the person who's here says, well, here is not here. Right? So we start seeing that they're not koans. And so Manjushri inquires, good sir, is your condition tolerable? Is it livable? He wants to find out how he's doing. Are your physical elements not disturbed? Is your sickness diminishing? And so on and so forth. And I will not read all of it, but Manjushri says, Manjushri, my sickness comes from ignorance and the thirst for existence, and it will last as long as do the sicknesses of all beings. I'm going to read that again. My sickness comes from ignorance and the thirst for existence, and it will last as long as do the sicknesses of all beings. Were all living beings to be free from sickness, I also would not be sick. Sounds like Bodhisattva vow stuff to me, huh? Right, so this meta story, I'm going to keep track of my time. You could see you could spend hours and hours and hours. And if you like this stuff, there's a lot of Robert Thurman YouTubes of him talking about it, right? Kind of line by line. So it's endlessly fascinating. But in this particular story, his illness is not physical illness. His illness is the illness of consciousness, right? Delusion, okay? And his illness, as he says, will be removed when all beings awaken. That's the Bodhisattva vow. So we can see in terms of this part of the story that we got a householder who's not well, who the God of wisdom shows up and says, hey, are you okay? And he says, well, as soon as we all wake up, I'll be fine. Not a bad Buddhist story in some way, or for those who are tracking, narratives of Buddhists from the Buddhist lands. So there's a few other pieces of the story that I want to just sort of cover that is just kind of worth sort of adding, because as I say, it's a wonderful text. Okay, there's lots of pieces of it. There's a really fascinating little subtale in it, which is well worth it in the 21st century, which is Shariputra kind of sticks his foot in it in some way. Shariputra is the fall guy, and there's a variety of moments where he's the fall guy, and Vimalakirti keeps reading his mind. Like, actually, there's a whole chapter on on Shariputra, like thinking that he's hungry. This has gone on for too long. And Vimalakirti is saying, you need something to eat? And so he goes off to another Buddha land that has this perfumed food, and he brings back food for everyone, right? Then they all have this sort of awakening food experience, which is a whole chapter, just to give you what sort of examples of magical in some ways. But this one end up story is this story of Shariputra meeting this goddess character, this woman character, who sort of sets a trap, and she fills the room with petals from, I think they're lotus flowers. And for all the Bodhisattvas, the petals just bounce off. And for all the folks who are not awake, it sticks. Okay? And Shariputra says, yo, we're not supposed to wear any garlands. We're not supposed to wear, if we're mendicants, we're not supposed to have flowers on us. Like, lady, can you like clean this up? And so then they have a little dialogue, right? And he sort of like kind of says, like, who are you? You're a woman. It's kind of what he says. And so there's this really interesting encounter there, because apparently she's a bodhisattva and she's an awakened one. So she does this little trick. He says to her, like, Shariputra says to her, she doesn't actually have a name, like, how'd you end up being a woman, right? And so she basically does a little magic, and she turns Shariputra into a woman and says, well, why don't you find out for yourself? Basically. And Shariputra goes, whoa, this is like, because he sort of represents, and this is an important scripture, this sort of that classic Indian, at that particular time, women were supposed to be inferior and they weren't allowed to practice. And so this woman basically gives Shariputra a taste of being female. And there's a lovely teaching where Buddha at the end of this says, on the inside, there's no gender. In non-duality, there's no gender. There's no difference. We're all the same. And in the relative world, there is gender. And that's okay. There's not a better or worse. There just is, right? And it's a lovely teaching, once again, 20 centuries ago, that is very relevant to this era that we're in, where gender is so fluid. So another example of the Vimalakirti teachings, having a interesting how you can write something 20 centuries ago and have it be so relevant 20 centuries later, huh? I guess there's no time in the Sutra land. Okay. The final story I want to tell, and then I should stop talking, I hope I'm being a little entertaining, is the most famous story, which is described as, well, that's giving it away, so I won't give it away, but it's the Dharma door of non-duality. Let me see if I get it right. So Vimalakirti basically asks the questions to the Bodhisattvas. Good sirs, please explore how the Bodhisattva enters the Dharma door of non-duality. Okay, and very similarly, one by one, all these different people respond, all these different bodhisattvas respond, and each one of the responses is a worthy teaching. I'll give you one. The Bodhisattva Tisya declares, good and evil are two, seeking neither good nor evil, the understanding of the non-duality of the significant and the meaningless is the entrance into non-duality. I'll read that again. Good and evil are two, seeking neither good nor evil. The understanding of the non-duality of the significant and the meaningless is the entrance into non-duality. And if we really wanted to study, we'd have to unpack each one of these, and they're all really good. And basically, they get to the end of this long thing, and Manjushri basically says, you know, all that is just blah, 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 blah. Okay? Because you're blah, 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 blah. Right? And so they turn around, and Manjushri says to Vimalakirti, your turn, please answer. And this is the famous moment, and Vimalakirti says nothing. He just, in our language, transmits, right? His presence the answer without language, without words. Okay, which is why the Vimalakirti's thunderous silence. Okay, and Manjushri, like, bingo, he got it. Right? That's what we're looking for. Not all this blah, 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 blah. Just, which is very much koan work in a way. Yeah, about how you show up. Can you show up to the moment of transmission? Let's see. The Crown Prince Manjushri applauded Vimalakirti. Excellent, excellent, noble sir. This is indeed the entrance into non-duality of Bodhisattvas. Here there is no use for syllables, sounds, and ideas. Very Zen, huh? Okay, so you see it's a Mahayana teaching, and that is why it's a wonderful text. Right, and a text that you can go in and out of over and over and over again. It's not a long text, but it's worth it. So, coming to wrap up on the fascinating story of Vimalakirti, right, which is he's a householder. Actually, turns out he's a wealthy householder, which is a really interesting thing. So he does a lot of good. When you hear the stories, he shows up in brothels. He shows up in, poor villages. He shows up and feeds people. So he really represents a person doing the bodhisattva work in a lot of ways. He's magical. Okay, he basically has all the powers of a bodhisattva, right? He's incredibly bright and he's willing to call people on it. So there's a similar way I see him, a little bit analogous to the way Ananda, who was the Buddha's, who took care of the Buddha, was the person who remembered all the sutras versus Mahakasyapa, who ends up being the next leader. Right, in the story, but Ananda's the brilliant one in a lot of ways, and Vimalakirti is the brilliant one in that particular way. He's ill, and his illness represents the illness of the consciousness that the Buddhist world view, that it's delusion is the issue really of our illness. He's got some really interesting stories, including one that has to do with gender fluidity and the fact that there is no issue with being male or female, and it's perfectly normal. And then, of course, finally, he's able to respond to the koan of the Dharma gates with his presence and his insight. And so he is applauded by Manjushri, which is really what he's most famous for. So he's a fascinating story, a really interesting bodhisattva for us to land on. And he really, if you were to look, if we would get under the hood, we'd see that all the pieces that we've done, which is why he's last, are mixed into this particular story. Seems like a good place to land. So, thank you. shining bright lotus.